How do you come up with a new story concept? I'm not talking about the off-the-wall individual ideas like, oh, what if pizza could talk? Or, I bet I could write a story about the first mouse astronaut. Mousetronaut? Anyway, writing a full story is a big job. It takes a lot of time and a lot of energy. So it's important to make sure that you have a solid story concept in place before you dive too far into the drafting process. And I'm not even talking about writing a thorough and detailed outline. If you're more of a discovery writer, then that's totally fine. You still want to make sure that your story concept has all the pieces in place that you're going to need to build on in order to tell a great story, and that gives you lots of room to explore and discover as you like to write. In my own experience, all of the story concepts that I have identified, the ones that I've written and the ones that I'm waiting to write, have started in one of three places, and after talking with a lot of my author friends and comparing notes, I found that the same is mostly true for them as well. Those three places are a person, a place, or a premise. Each of those three places offers some advantages as a starting point, but also presents some gaps that you know you're going to need to fill in by circling around and touching on all three to develop a complete story concept, regardless of which one you began with in the first place. So let's take a look at each three in detail and talk a little bit more about how they can serve you as you are developing a story concept. Let's start off by looking at person as a starting place. Oftentimes, a character concept might come to mind, a type of person, a particular element of backstory or experience, a personality or a skill set or a career or something along those lines. One of the advantages of starting with a person or a character in mind is that it gives you a lot of the definition of one of the most important elements of your story, which is a strong central character that's going to drive the narrative forward. So beginning by fleshing out, who is this person? Why are they like this way? What makes them interesting? What makes them stand out? What is holding them back? What are they going to have to overcome? And kind of playing 20 questions with yourself to more fully flesh out that character and make them more well-rounded and full-featured can be a great place to start exploring the rest of your story. One of the disadvantages of starting with a person as an idea is that a character out of context is very often bland or is harder to define. It's really difficult to separate a character entirely from their setting. So let's say that you started by thinking of an idea of a world-famous neurosurgeon who's arrogant and, doesn't get along well with others. Okay, cool, but that's going to play out really differently in a period war epic as opposed to, let's say, a Marvel movie, for example. The setting and the other surrounding characters and the context of the story that your character is placed in is going to have a huge influence on the character themselves. So you need to make sure that as soon as possible, you move away from just the concept of the character and begin placing them into context in their place. One of the ways I like to work on this, which can help create some really interesting story possibilities, is to think of one or more interesting or unusual contrasts, places or situations or circumstances that you wouldn't normally expect to find that kind of character in. And when you do that, oftentimes really interesting story possibilities begin to suggest themselves. So going back to our previous example, yes, our highly trained neurosurgeon, what if he found himself in a world of sorcery and superheroes? That's an interesting and very different kind of story. Maybe you start off with the concept of a world-famous dancer, ballerina. What if she got drafted into the army and became a fighter pilot? All of a sudden, the contrast there, even if you don't necessarily decide to pursue that story thread all the way and keep it, can raise some really interesting possibilities, can help you get to know your character better. And that's the kind of exploration you want to begin doing as soon as possible. If you have a character concept, you need to begin fleshing out ideas of place and circumstance to give them grounding and orientation in your story. Moving on from there, let's talk about place next, because sometimes thinking of a place or a location or a setting can be the perfect way to begin developing your story concept. You don't necessarily have to have a character in place right from the beginning of developing your story concept. Sometimes you just know that you would love to write a story set in a certain time period or location. Maybe you want to write a story in World War II era Hawaii because maybe that's where you grew up, and so you have a lot of orientation there and a lot of personal experience, and it's meaningful to you. And the idea of that setting and some of the richness of that setting and location and time period really appeals to you, you can start there as a point of inspiration. If you're a speculative fiction writer, this is often a great place to begin. If you write fantasy or science fiction or magical realism, thinking of a really poignant or memorable or standout type of location, a world with really interesting rules or features, or a spaceship that's different or exciting in some particular way. Not just your run-of-the-mill, oh, this is what I assume, but what if it was like this? And the fact that it's like this is really, wow, that's super cool. And then now I'm interested in this, and the setting or the location or the place is my initial point of connection. That can be a really strong advantage because it helps you develop the broader world of the story. And oftentimes, place and circumstance has so much to do with the type of story that you're telling. And so it can give you some really cool ideas or a really phenomenal place to begin. One of the disadvantages, however, is that place isn't story. You need characters for story to happen. So kind of the reverse of our previous example, if you begin with an idea of a place, a really cool, let's say we don't know that this is the way it played out, but let's say that J.K. Rowling began her idea for the Harry Potter series, not with Harry as a character, but with Hogwarts as a location, this really cool hidden school for wizards that's set sort of in the normal world, but hidden away, and has all of these interesting classes that are taught and high school or middle school life, but for wizards. That's fine. You can start off with a story premise that is mostly about place and location, but then you need to begin thinking about how that place and location would infer an ideal kind of protagonist and antagonist, a cast of characters, because characters are what actually create story through their desires, their flaws, their motivations, and their efforts to do certain things and get into conflict with each other. So if you're starting out with a premise, develop that premise of a place as thoroughly as you can, but make sure that you then move on to thinking back about character as well, and think about what kinds of characters would serve that place and let you develop and tell the kind of story you're interested in telling in that setting. Before we jump into number 3, if you're enjoying this video or finding it helpful, please take a second to click the like button to help other people find it. And if you are looking forward to more discussions of story concepts, writing craft, and story reviews of popular books and movies, then subscribe to the channel for more in the future. Finally, let's talk about our third starting point for core concept, which is premise. Premise is the what if idea, and very often, especially in script writing or when you're talking about films, premise is king, because everybody wants to know that 1 or 2 sentence log line, like dinosaurs have been cloned and they just got out, or giant shark terrorizes New England beachgoers, or fill in the blank. So premise can, again, be a really cool place to start a story. And sometimes premise even implies character right away. Like the premise of The Fugitive is, what if a world-famous doctor was framed for his wife's murder and had to try and solve her murder while on the run from the FBI? Okay, that's a really gripping premise right off the bat. There's inherent conflict and stakes, and oftentimes a lot of plot is suggested in premise. So if you have an idea for a real specific premise that you are starting off with, something that catches your attention, catches your interest. What if all of a sudden we woke up one morning and humans couldn't have babies anymore? That's a cool premise that gave rise to the story of Children of Men. And a premise-based story concept can often be really gripping, and one of the advantages of starting with a premise is it gives you a really clear through line. The story is about this. We're going to explore this what-if situation or this interesting circumstance that we throw the characters into. We're going to see what happens. And the other advantage of starting with premise is you kind of have your hook built right into the concept that you're developing, because if it's an interesting premise, you can share it right away. It's harder to explain what the story is about if you mostly have a concept for a character and someone's like, oh, what's your story about? It's like, well, I have this idea for this character who does these things. He's from these place. He has this desire. Okay, fine. But if the premise is, giant asteroid just discovered, it's about to crash into Earth, everyone only discovers they have a week to live. That's a premise. Oh, okay. I can jump onto that immediately and begin to fill in some of the gaps about what some of the conflict and inherent possibilities of that story might be. But just like with place, one of the disadvantages of starting with premise is that premise is also not a story. It's a starting point for a story. It's like lining up a bunch of dominoes, but the dominoes themselves are still the characters and their motivation, their choices, their behaviors, their actions, their drive, their conflict. So making sure if you do start with the idea of a premise, don't get swept away and assume that the premise itself will carry the entire script. I think a lot of Hollywood movies make this mistake. A great premise is an awesome starting point, but if you want a great story, you need great characters and great setting too. So make sure as you develop out the concept of your premise, as soon as possible, begin thinking about who are the characters that would carry the power of this premise or the possibilities that are inherent in it most effectively. What type of characters, what type of background or situation, what type of personality would create the most interesting sort of vehicle for this premise to be paid off as I tell the story. So with the foundation of person, place, and premise now under our belts, I think you can probably see where we're going with this. A great story concept needs to have some clarity about all three of those elements. But knowing that you don't have to start with all three can actually make it a lot easier to come up with your story concept in the first place. Start with the thing that grabs your imagination the most. I highly recommend keeping a notebook with you in your bag, or if you use an app like Notion or something else on your phone to capture ideas as they come to you, or a sleep journal, whatever methods you use to keep your imagination, keep track of it and keep it on the page or capture it somewhere. Very often, those initial sparks of an idea, they're not usually going to be fully sufficient on their own. If you have a kernel of an idea for an interesting character or a little what if that grabs your attention, it's not really going to be a story concept until you have all three. But if you just give yourself permission to capture the individual pieces as they come to you, have fun with them, imagine them, spend time daydreaming about them, maybe talk about them with a friend a little bit, explore them so that you capture them and you kind of mine them for whatever possibilities they might have that to offer you. But don't just stop there. Once you have one of those three as a starting point, spend some intentional time asking yourself questions and developing out ideas. Don't lock into the very first thing you think of. And brainstorming in that way very often will lead you to some really cool possibilities that you might not have thought of before. So taking wherever you begin with in your story concept development, but then spending the intentional time to say, well, I have a character. What about a place? What are some ideas that I might have? What are 4 or 5 or 10 ideas for time, period, setting, circumstance that might be interesting or unusual, that might really help this character shine? And then what might be a premise that would actually sort of orient and define the story of this character as they live in this place? What if that's the place they live in and that's the character, but then this happens, and the fact that just happens at the beginning of the story, or this creates, shocks the world, or does this big disruptive thing in their life, that opens up new possibilities. Keep working on your story concept until you have at least some solid starting point for all three of those pieces. And I think you'll find that the triangulation of all three of those elements will create a really solid foundation of a story concept, which you can then take and develop either into a full outline or as the starting point for some discovery writing as you begin to explore and tell a really awesome story.